Ethiopia's Amhara conflict could spark civil war. Simmering grievances and escalating clashes in the region threaten to trigger another humanitarian disaster. This is an analysis by Adam Kassi Abibi, Vice President of the African Network of Constitutional Lawyers, and Zelalem Mogies, an Ethiopian international lawyer focused on human rights issues, particularly in Africa, published by Foreign Policy. As Ethiopia hosted the African Union Summit last month, the government's attempt to generate a sense of exuberance in the capital city, Addis Ababa, masked the expanding spiral of instability and humanitarian tragedy in the country. On January 29th, in Marawi, a small town in the Amhara region, members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces murdered dozens of civilians execution style, according to national and international human rights groups and media reports. Although the government denies targeting civilians, the killings were reportedly motivated by revenge, following a bloody state confrontation with so-called Fano fighters, Amhara combatants, who have been fighting government forces since August 2023. The Fano represent an armed manifestation of the long-standing grievances of the Amhara people, rooted in decades-old systemic marginalization, mass killings, and displacement of Amharas in various parts of the country, and exacerbated by dashed hopes in the willingness and ability of Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government to stem the group's marginalization. While the movement remains decentralized and there is no formal political manifesto, the militia proclaims to protect Amhara interests by working to transform what it perceives as an anti-Amhara socio-political system. It seeks to establish a new order grounded in equality among all groups, respect for individual rights, rule of law, and democracy. The Fano proceeded, but rose to prominence during the Tigray War, 2022, when they fought beside government forces. During the war, they, along with the Ethiopian army, Tigrayan fighters, and Eritrean troops, faced accusations of human rights abuses. The Amhara conflict coexists with a no-war, no-peace situation in the Tigray region, where famine-like conditions and starvation-induced deaths have been reported, and armed confrontation, kidnappings, and regular travel disruptions in the Oromia region. Ethiopia's economy is also in a precarious state, with the government defaulting on interest payments for loans with private creditors. The January Marawi massacre is the most gruesome so far, and regrettably not the first. In September 2023, similar civilian killings were reported in the historic Amhara cities of Lalibela and Majete. The Marawi massacre elicited domestic and international condemnation and calls for transparent investigation from the Ethiopian National Human Rights Commission, the United States, and the European Union. The series of tragedies underscore a fundamental and concerning shift in the nature of the conflict. As armed confrontation drags on, weary government soldiers inevitably start to consider the broader public complicit in the rebellion and are therefore more willing to engage in collective punishment of Amhara communities, which in turn intensifies animosity and cycles of violence. Despite some stalled efforts to peacefully end the war in Oromia and the government paying lip service to a possible negotiation in Amhara, political and military leaders continue to deploy the language of force and pursue militarized responses. Indeed, on February 2nd, the government extended the state of emergency it first imposed in August 2023 in response to the insurgency. The state of emergency has given government forces carte blanche to engage in the extrajudicial arrest of thousands of people, including prominent Amhara members of parliament, who have been detained for months despite enjoying constitutional immunity from arrest and prosecution. Amhara mistrust of the Ethiopian government was already growing due to the unabated killing and displacement of Amharas living outside their home region, particularly in Oromia. Moreover, in recent years, civilians attempting to enter Addis Ababa from the Amhara region have been barred, seemingly because they are perceived as a collective security threat. The situation took a particularly alarming turn in September 2023, when videos circulated on social media depicting people detained in deplorable conditions across various locations in both Addis Ababa and Oromia. The US-based Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention issued a red flag alert, characterizing the mass abduction and detention of Amharas as potentially indicative of a looming genocide. The popular Amhara perception has been that there is a deliberate effort to undermine Amharas inside and outside their region, including increasingly in the allocation of federal subsidies to regions and provision of basic agricultural necessities, such as fertilizer and seeds. Today, the Amhara fear fundamentally revolves not only around issues of ethnic federalism and the desire to halt killing and displacement, but also, crucially, around the perceived desire of Oromo elites to further marginalize and impoverish Amharas and render them at best permanent junior political partners at the national level. The conflict is now reaching a tipping point, with the federal army facing regular Fano guerrilla attacks and reports of civilian massacres increasing. The situation is morphing into a widespread popular revolt. While the conflict with the Fano has so far been largely restricted to the Amhara region, as popular anger increases, the chances of expansion of sporadic attacks in Addis Ababa and other regions and, ultimately, a full-blown civil war cannot be excluded. With the harvest season approaching, the disruption of the transport system and limited supply of seeds and fertilizer will also deepen the already dire humanitarian situation, not only in Amhara, but also across the country, as the region is one of Ethiopia's breadbaskets. Together with the war and disruptions caused by the Oromia conflict, continued conflict in Amhara will worsen the threats of famine and generate an exodus of people within Ethiopia, but potentially also across borders. Halting the fighting requires confidence-building measures from the government, including lifting the state of emergency, availing humanitarian assistance, releasing the thousands of prisoners, fully reinstating internet and telecommunications services, and conducting independent investigations into atrocities, and commitment to hold those responsible accountable. A sense of marginalization is at the core of the conflict, and resolving it requires the formation of a popular and legitimate Amhara government and genuine Amhara representation in federal institutions. Considering the absence of a centralized and legitimate opposition political force in the Amhara region, setting up an inclusive and legitimate government would require a bottom-up approach where credible representatives would be identified at district levels and collectively form an Amhara council, which would then constitute an interim regional executive. The Amhara branch of the Prosperity Party will naturally be reluctant to accept the formation of an interim government, claiming its ostensible victory in the 2021 elections. Nevertheless, the widespread sense of lack of representation and the virtual collapse of the regional governance system and replacement with an emergency military command represents a loss of any remnants of legitimacy for the party and an intransigent reliance on force to maintain a bygone status quo would further muddy the party's reputation.